The 12th of July 1944. The morning light is a flat, gray thing under clouds that threaten rain but never quite commit. You stand with mud to your knees on the bank of a low, angry river, brown, quick, and carrying the taste of churned earth and diesel. The trees along the far side are black silhouettes. The ruined farmhouse that used to pilot the road across has lost its roof and most of its pride. Men around you are breathing like they've run for an hour when in truth most have been awake since 2 in the morning, waiting for orders. The smell of wet canvas, hot metal, and cigarette smoke fills the air. Somewhere upstream a mule of a generator chugs. Underfoot the bank slides. Lieutenant John H. Harris of C Company, 12th Combat Engineer Battalion, takes his binoculars off. His palms are red and raw from gripping the glass, and his wool gloves are more holes than glove. He squints at the far bank, at clumps of German infantrymen who have not yet believed that what they see is possible. The Germans are in groups of 2 or 3, mouths open like boys watching a magic trick. Their faces are shut behind helmet rims and creased with years of training that told them rivers were walls. They were taught that rivers meant bridges or pontoons, and bridges could be mined, and pontoons could be shelved. And either way a river would slow an army into an easy meal. Bring the little boats up, Harris says, but his voice is not certain. He has been in river crossings before. He knows what a river crossing looks like. Rope lines, engineer pontoons slammed across by bulldozers, planks and cable, entire days swallowed by a single crossing. Today, though, something else hums in the distance. It begins as a low, metallic cough, engine notes filtered and strange, like a throat clearing. Then the shapes arrive. Small, squat vehicles that look like jeeps with an extra confidence to their stance. They ride the river like a pack of beavers. Lieutenant Harris watches as one of them rises over a lip of current and slides onto the far bank as if it has always belonged there. Its driver, Private Miguel Ramos, who at 21 has a permanent smear of oil on his jaw and the impatience of youth, brings the little craft to a halt, throws the transmission into reverse, and grins. The vehicle is a Ford GPA nicknamed by men who loved shortening everything into something sharper, the Seep. You smell the gasoline before you see the green paint up close. The Seep's canvas top sags with river spray, its bonnet is dotted with beads of water and the tinny sound of small metal things loosening in the shaking. A propeller churns the river behind it, a bilge pump whines. Men spill out, boots squishing, faces white with the shock of cold. One of them, Corporal Sam Llewellyn, drops to his knees and presses his palms into the river as if to test its reality. Around him, officers and NCOs are barking orders as if this were an ordinary disembarkation. But it is not ordinary. These jeeps did not wait for bridges, they did not require engineers to string large assemblies. They were, in their strange, inconvenient way, independent. On the far bank, still partially hidden by the ruined orchard and the long waist-high grass, German officers watch. Oberleutnant Klaus Ritter, a man whose face is as long as his creed, raises a field glass and stares until his knuckles whiten. His adjutant, Lieutenant Friedrich Moeller, laughs first, the short, brittle sound of someone who believes he is watching fools. Amerikaner, Moeller hisses, with toys. They expected amphibious operations in ports or beaches, not river crossings by what looks like motoring toys. Harris hears the laugh and knows the danger of a laugh on the wrong bank. Laughs can breed confidence. Confidence can breed movement. He signals forward. The Seep drivers know the drill, slide in, throttle carefully, keep the nose up, avoid eddies that bite at the rear. They drive these little crafts like they're half fisherman, half daredevil. Engineers who designed the Seep, the Ford engineer whose name is tucked in a report that will later gather dust in brass folders, had taken a Willys pattern, stretched and sealed a hull, and added a prop, a rudder, and a set of watertight doors. Men who were not engineers called it a miracle. Engineers called it an answer to a question no one had asked until the war made new questions urgent. The Seep is not graceful. It is awkward and boxy, and it heels with each turn like a careful horse. It bobs on the river and throws sprays of mud that catch on the canvas of the men waiting on the bank like confetti. Some of the jeeps are Willys MBs, their standard bodies. Others are the amphibious GPA conversion, with riveted seams and a slightly higher stance. Each one, though, carries a load. Rations, ammunition, a Browning M1000, 919 machine gun lashed to the bow of one, a jerry can on the running board of another. Behind the engines, soldiers joke to keep from thinking about the current. A private hums an off-key hymn. In the Seep's cramped cockpit, The water hits the frame with soft slaps, and the radio operator, technician 5th grade Arthur Green, curses at the reception as if radios were people. A German machine gun crack snaps the morning. It's not well aimed. A stray burst clips the far bank and kicks up a geyser of mud between two hedgerows. Everyone ducks. For a heart-stopping second, the river becomes ounces and inches and decisions. Harris tastes metal on his tongue. He wants to order retreat, or push, or charge. Instead he does the calibrated thing an engineer does when confronted by something that will or will not hold. He measures. The jeeps pause at a midstream sandbar. Men stand on the fenders and shout. A German observer lifts his binoculars and sees a man balancing on a jeep's hood, whistling at the dare. From the German side, small arms chatter continues. But the Americans have a peculiar kind of momentum. Jeeps can dart forward faster than infantry can bring machine guns to bear, and the river's bend gives little cover to sharpshooters while offering plenty for a hull that rides the surface like a duck. The Seep's propellers cavitate in the shallow water and then hit clear current, then they bite into a push and the vehicle slides ashore. Men pour out and push up hedgerows as if this were simply a landed patrol from a beachhead, except they are in the center of a green field with a makeshift orchard to one side and a shell of a farmhouse to the other. On the German bank, the mood shifts from disbelief to cold calculation. Oberleutnant Ritter moves like a man with a map in his head mapping routes of retreat, counting the ways a river once thought impenetrable has become a door. He snaps an order to his radio operator, a thin man with a permanent cigarette glued to his lip. "Report," Ritter says, and his voice has the brittle iron of someone about to accept that the world is not what he thought. The Seep drivers don't talk about doctrine. They talk about hours of practice. About sealing seams with a mixture that smelled like turpentine and hope, about the first time a vehicle failed and foundered and men had to wrestle with wet canvas and clutch control. They talk about fixes, short rods to brace the prop, canvas patches, a makeshift bilge pump that a mechanic named Lewis clamped under a seat. It is in these small improvisations, these finger marks of human ingenuity, that the Seep becomes more than a contraption. It becomes a node in a new system of movement. Back on the bank, a captured German NCO Herr, still wet with river spray, collar askew, stares as his captors lay down a line of cable intended for a conventional ford. He spits at the mud and says, in broken English, "In my school, river is river, you need bridge." He looks at Lieutenant Harris like someone who has had a tenet of life pulled from under him. The way he says bridge is an accusation and a question. Harris answers with a laugh that is more an exhale. "We brought our own bridges," he says, and his mouth tastes like diesel. He knows the truth is more complicated. They brought men who could improvise, machines that could be adapted, and a logistics doctrine that prized mobility, supplies on the move rather than supplies behind a fixed line. It's a doctrine that would, in weeks and months, haunt whatever remains of the Wehrmacht's ability to hold ground. On the river, a Seep that has taken a glancing round limps but keeps going. The driver is bleeding through a sleeve, but he keeps the throttle steady. Men lash down a wrecked truck a few yards upriver and use it as a cover to lay smoke. The farmhouse's ruin is now filled with the sounds of shouting English, patched German, the language of orders. The Seep's engine whines like a living thing, tired but unwilling to die. Further back, the first of the truck convoys arrive. They are not amphibious. They are heavy and taxed and waiting for bridging equipment that might never arrive in time. Yet the Seep's little sorties have changed the tempo. Where a river once planned calendars, now timetables are in hours. A captain with a clipboard walks down the line and marks a column. Supply, ammunition, medevac. The tally is pragmatic. What can cross, what cannot? Some items will wait, most will find a way. Across the water, Oberleutnant Ritter folds his hands, and for once his training has no answer. He watches men who, by the very act of crossing water in small green boats, have redefined what a front line is. The river that should have been a moat is now a lane. It is a small and humiliating reconfiguration for a soldier whose doctrine built walls of stone and steel. He has been stunned not by a storm or by artillery, but by mechanics and courage and the simple arrogance of a people who refuse to accept the river's veto. You can feel it in the mud. The future of movement is not in the big crossing alone, but in the cumulative small ones. The Seep is less a miracle than a symptom. It announces that mobility can come in strange packages, and that the side which moves faster, with more improvisation and fewer assumptions about what an obstacle means, will usually decide where the line is drawn. The men in green jeeps are not the whole army, but they are the irritation that becomes an infection. And as the morning unfolds, the river will give up more than a bank. It will surrender the illusion that water alone can stop a determined supply train. The story of that morning on the river in Normandy doesn't begin there. It begins 2 years earlier in 1942 on the Detroit River, under a winter sky that burned white over the ice-crusted shoreline. At the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant, engineers stood ankle-deep in slush, watching a prototype sink. The crowd of draftsmen and mechanics didn't say much as the olive-green vehicle disappeared beneath the surface, bubbles marking its grave. Someone coughed, someone else muttered that it looked good on paper. The man at the center of it, Chief Engineer Delmar G. Barney Roos, didn't flinch. He simply turned to his foreman and said, "Next one floats." The Ford GPA Government P. Amphibious was born not from inspiration, but from irritation. The U.S. Army needed a vehicle that could bridge the impossible gap between road and water, something smaller and faster than a landing craft, but more versatile than a pontoon. Rivers were halting Allied advances from North Africa to the Italian hills. When bridges were blown and pontoon units lagged behind, divisions stalled. The amphibious Jeep would solve that, or at least that was the theory. Inside Ford's design offices, draftsmen drew what they jokingly called a bathtub with wheels. They lengthened the body of the standard Willys Jeep, sealed the seams, and built a shallow steel hull. They fitted a screw propeller at the back, connected to a driveshaft through a transfer case. Then they added a rudder, bilge pumps, and watertight hatches. It looked ridiculous. It was ridiculous. But on paper, it worked. Test driver Red Thomas remembered the first real test on the Rouge. "We launched it like a boat. The damn thing didn't even sink." Barney just nodded, climbed in, and drove it straight across the channel like it was Sunday morning on Belle Isle. The Seep, the soldier's nickname, a play on Sea Jeep, wasn't perfect. It was cramped, slow in the water, and temperamental. Its low freeboard meant it could handle lakes and rivers, but not open seas. Its weight made it sluggish on land. But it could do something no other light vehicle could: transition from land to water and back again without pause. In late 1942, production began in earnest. Ford's River Rouge assembly lines, already running day and night, began stamping and welding the amphibious bodies by the thousands. Detroit's sky glowed orange from the blast furnaces. Sparks from welders turned the factory floor into a constant, flickering dawn. Every vehicle came off the line with a faint smell of oil, primer, and the Michigan River. The first batches were sent to training grounds in Louisiana, where soldiers learned to waterproof radios and tie down rifles with rubber cords. It was half soldiering, half boating, one sergeant said later. The Army didn't know whether to issue us paddles or rifles. When General Eisenhower saw a Seep demonstration in England in early 1944, he reportedly smiled and said, "Well, if this doesn't surprise the Germans, nothing will." He was right. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy, the Ford GPA had spread across multiple theaters. In Italy, they had already proved their worth crossing rivers where bridges had been shelled to rubble. They carried ammunition, wounded men, and sometimes messages through channels that had once been considered impassable. But it wasn't until Normandy, in those chaotic weeks after D-Day, that their psychological impact became truly clear. German officers like Oberleutnant Ritter, who had spent his career memorizing maps of choke points in rivers, believed that terrain dictated tactics. That rivers were immutable barriers to movement. He had seen tanks bogged down for days waiting for bridging units. He had seen supply trucks pile up like dead insects behind broken fords. What he saw on that morning near Avranches, jeeps floating across water like fishing boats, then rolling onto dry ground without delay, upended every assumption he had. And the brilliance wasn't just the machine, it was the doctrine behind it. The U.S. Army understood that victory wasn't only about weapons. It was about movement. About denying the enemy the luxury of time to prepare. The Ford GPA was never meant to fight, it was meant to erase hesitation. Lieutenant Harris and his engineers were part of that grand experiment. Their orders were simple. Never stop. If a road failed, make a new one. If a bridge fell, cross anyway. That idea of relentless, fluid motion would define American warfare in the latter half of the war. Still, the Seep's success came at a cost. Many sank. Rivers in Europe weren't as forgiving as test lakes in Michigan. A hidden current or a sharp rock could puncture the thin hull. Soldiers sometimes overloaded the vehicles, cramming too much gear into their shallow frames. When they flooded, they went down fast. There was no armor, no margin for error. But the men drove them anyway because every minute saved meant more pressure on the retreating Wehrmacht. The Ford GPA was far from perfect. But to those who used it, imperfection was irrelevant. What mattered was that it worked enough. It crossed rivers. It broke rhythm. And that was enough to stun the enemy. By the time Harris's unit reached Avranches that July morning, the Seep had already become a legend in whispers. Those little swimming jeeps, the Germans called them. Some claimed they were radio-controlled, others thought they were secret British inventions. In truth, they were just Detroit steel and American stubbornness welded into one improbable shape. On that riverbank, as the last Seep pulled itself dripping from the water, Harris turned to his radio operator and said, "Tell command, crossing secure, no bridge required." Behind them, the rest of the column began to move trucks, tanks, medics, the machinery of war flowing forward, unimpeded. For the Germans who watched, the sight wasn't just a tactical loss. It was a revelation that the enemy they fought didn't just adapt to terrain, they rewrote it. The crossing at Avranches was more than an isolated act of ingenuity. It was a visible, echoing symbol of what the Americans had learned, that in modern war, speed killed. Every river, every destroyed bridge, every washed-out road that was supposed to buy the Wehrmacht time now meant nothing. By mid-July 1944, the bocage country of Normandy had become a labyrinth of green walls and narrow lanes. The hedgerows, centuries old, had slowed even Sherman tanks to a crawl. The Allies had air superiority, but they couldn't bomb their way through every kilometer of farmland. What they needed was not just power, but fluidity. And that's what the engineers, with their strange little boats on wheels, brought to the fight. Lieutenant Harris's company became a kind of roving miracle service. When a road disappeared into a crater, they built a ford. When a bridge went down, they sent the Seeps first scouting, mapping, hauling ropes across for the rest. They moved at night, headlamps off, guided by the soft gurgle of water and the muted hum of their engines. Each crossing became a theater of improvisation. Sometimes the men tied tree trunks together as makeshift docks, sometimes they lashed planks across the Seeps to carry wounded soldiers or crates of mortar shells. Each mission was half engineering, half desperation. In the command tents behind the front, staff officers began marking Seeps as force multipliers. It sounded clinical, but in the mud, it meant survival. The little amphibious jeeps could carry reconnaissance units across rivers that would have taken hours to flank. They could bring up radio operators and artillery spotters where traditional supply lines hadn't yet caught up. The Seeps, in a strange way, democratized the battlefield. Infantrymen who once waited helplessly for engineers now had mobility in their own hands. Across the front, German officers noticed. Reports from captured documents tell of increasing frustration. One colonel in the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division scribbled in his log, "Americans cross rivers as if they are roads. We destroy bridges, they do not care. They bring small machines that swim." Impossible. The German army had spent years mastering the art of static defense, the careful positioning of obstacles and choke points, the belief that geography was a weapon. The Americans, with their jeeps and bulldozers and Seeps, turned geography into an inconvenience. Oberleutnant Ritter, the same officer who had watched the crossing at Avranches, spent the following weeks retreating south with the remnants of his battalion. The image of those Seeps haunted him. He wrote in his diary, later found in a farmhouse near Rennes, "They crossed where we thought they could not. Not with tanks, not with bridges. They simply crossed. I felt as though the ground itself betrayed us." Meanwhile, Harris's men barely noticed the strategic impact of what they were doing. To them, the Seep was just another tool in a war filled with strange tools. They joked that it was the world's smallest navy. They painted shark mouths on the fronts, wrote names like Mud Duck, Minnow, and Lucky Floater on the hulls. One night, under moonlight silvering the surface of the Saloon River, Private Ramos, the same driver who first crossed at Avranches, leaned on his jeep's hood and said to Corporal Llewellyn, "You realize the Krauts probably think we've got amphibious tanks by now?" Llewellyn laughed. "Let 'em think it. Fear's lighter than fuel." They didn't know it yet, but they were part of a quiet revolution in logistics. American warfare had always leaned on industry, on factories that could build faster than the enemy could destroy. But now, mobility itself had become a kind of production line. Each obstacle overcome added hours to the clock of advance. The Seeps were never glamorous, never celebrated like the P-51 seconds or Shermans, but they embodied the same philosophy: overcome the impossible, even if it looks absurd. By August 1944, as Patton's Third Army broke through German lines in Operation Cobra, the amphibious jeeps were everywhere. They ferried scouts across tributaries of the Loire, they retrieved downed pilots, they hauled cables for pontoon bridges that hadn't yet arrived. To the Germans watching them from retreating positions, it must have felt like chasing ghosts, these small, buzzing creatures that appeared wherever there was water, then vanished again into hedgerows and fields. The river that once divided North and South France became, for the Americans, a seam to be stitched rather than an obstacle to fear. And so, when captured officers were later interrogated, their disbelief became legend. Many spoke of the floating jeeps, describing them with the same awe as they once spoke of tanks in 1940. To them, it wasn't the machine itself that mattered, it was what it represented, a military that refused to be still, a logistics system that could rewrite the rules of terrain itself. Lieutenant Harris would later say, during a debrief near Chartres, "We didn't build a bridge that day, we built disbelief." He wasn't wrong. For every German who watched a seep crawl out of a river like a mechanical amphibian, something in the logic of the war broke. Rivers were supposed to stop armies. That morning, they stopped believing that. August 4, 1944. Near the town of Rennes, France. The morning sun rises like a flare through smoke that hasn't lifted since the previous night's bombardment. The air smells of diesel, cordite, and crushed wheat. On the western approach, a column of seeps idles beside a narrow tributary of the Vilaine River. Their engines growl with that high, metallic pitch unique to overworked Fords. Private Ramos is in the lead again, tapping the dashboard like a horseman calming his mount. His fingers are raw from days of steering through mud, his uniform crusted with a second skin of dirt. Across the river, on the opposite embankment, the Germans have blown the bridge again. The twisted rebar and concrete hang like ribs over the water. They assume it will buy them at least a few hours. Enough time to regroup. Enough time to flee east toward Le Mans. They assume wrong. Ramos looks over at Lieutenant Harris, who raises a hand. 2 fingers go. The first, seep noses into the current. Its bow dips for a moment as the wheels leave solid ground, then steadies as the propeller catches water. The vehicle hums, part boat, part machine, part stubborn act of will. Within minutes, 3 more follow, forming a loose column that glides silently across the brown river. The only sounds are the rhythmic burble of engines and the hiss of spray against steel. The German sentries on the far bank don't open fire at first, they stare. They have never seen anything like it. By the time one of them recovers enough sense to raise his rifle, Ramos's jeep is already climbing the opposite slope, tires biting into mud. Behind him, the rest of the column follows, green, dripping, relentless. Within half an hour, American infantry are streaming across. Within 2 hours, the entire battalion has bridged what should have been a day's obstacle. By nightfall, the engineers have thrown a temporary pontoon over the river, but the fight has already moved beyond it. The seep drivers have done their job again, turning rivers into afterthoughts. Farther back, in a field command post lined with maps and telephones, Colonel Darby of the 2nd Armored Division receives the report. He grins, teeth flashing in lamplight. Crossed without a bridge, huh? That'll make the Krauts crazy. An aide glances up. They already are, sir. Darby laughs and turns back to his map, where the blue lines of rivers have been crossed out with pencil and ink so many times they're barely visible anymore. The very geography of France, once a weapon of defense, is being erased by motion. That night, in a commandeered barn lit by kerosene lanterns, Harris's men eat from tin mess kits balanced on their knees. Their uniforms are stiff with dried mud, their hands smell like oil and river water. "Hey, Ramos," Llewellyn says, half through a mouthful of beans. "You realize the whole German army probably thinks you're some kind of magician?" Ramos chuckles. "Nah. Just a guy with a weird boat and bad luck." But there's pride in his voice. Outside, the seeps are lined up like tired animals, their hulls dented, their propellers streaked with grime. They've carried the men through 8 crossings in as many days. Some leak. Some rattle like tin cans. But they keep running. To the soldiers, they're not marvels anymore. They're just part of the job, a strange, amphibious rhythm in a war of constant movement. For the Germans, though, the shock lingers. Weeks later, after Rennes falls and Allied intelligence begins processing captured diaries, the disbelief spills from the pages. A Wehrmacht captain writes, "We saw the enemy cross the river without pause. No bridging train, no engineers. The vehicles drove into the water and out again. I could not believe my eyes. We have no answer for such machines. Another note from a lieutenant in the 91st Air Landing Division. They are everywhere. These swimming jeeps. Even small creeks no longer protect our positions. We cannot prepare, for they come from any direction. For an army built on the assumption that terrain dictates victory, the seeps were a psychological weapon, small, unarmored, but profoundly demoralizing. By September, as the Allied advance reached the Seine, the seeps became common sight in convoys and forward patrols. What had begun as an engineering curiosity was now an accepted part of logistics doctrine. The American Army had learned something the Germans hadn't, that adaptability, not perfection, wins wars. The seep wasn't the best at anything, not as a car, not as a boat, not even as a reliable piece of machinery. But it was good enough at everything. And in modern warfare, that was often what mattered most. Late one evening, near the newly liberated town of Chartres, Harris sat beside his seep under a fading pink sky. The war was moving east now, the rivers getting wider, the pace faster. He ran a hand along the vehicle's dented fender and murmured to no one in particular, "You did your job." A mechanic nearby looked up. "Sir." Harris smiled faintly. "Just talking to the boat that thought it was a jeep." He could still see, in his mind's eye, the stunned faces of the Germans across that first river, the disbelief that something so small, so mundane, had undone years of military planning. That moment, more than any bombardment or air raid, symbolized the war's turning tide, the realization that industrial creativity and improvisation could beat doctrine and dogma. Because the river had never really been the obstacle. The obstacle was imagination. And that, in the end, was what America had conquered. In later years, few would remember the Ford GPA. It would fade into the footnotes of history, a failed experiment, too ungainly for post-war life, too specialized for peace. Most were scrapped, sold, or abandoned in the mud of Europe and the jungles of Burma. But for a few months in 1944, they were the stuff of legends. And to those who saw them, the German officers who watched rivers cease to matter, and the American engineers who refused to stop, the memory of those little swimming jeeps would remain a quiet reminder of what ingenuity can do when the world demands the impossible.